The phone call lasted 90 seconds. By the end of it, my marriage was over again, and somehow I was the villain. It started with a credit card, a card I'd asked her a month earlier to stop using. I'd even told her in writing that I was going to lock it. Then one afternoon she tried to use it, it declined, and she called to ask what happened. I said the thing I'd already said a month before: I locked it. Remember. That was the whole crime, 3 words. What came back down the phone wasn't a sentence, it was a detonation. Screaming, then a barrage of messages, each one bigger than the last. We're done, don't ever ask me for anything again. And then the one that told me this was never about a card at all. Remember the dream I had where you betrayed me? Here it is. She was going to move out, take our daughter, leave me behind, righteous, furious, gone. And here's the reaction I'm not proud of, the one that told me how far down this had gone. I didn't feel panic, I didn't feel heartbreak, I felt relief. Because I'd been here before, dozens of times, and some quiet, exhausted part of me thought, maybe this is the one that finally sticks. It wouldn't, it never does. Tonight I want to show you why, and why the reason it never sticks is the same reason. For years, I couldn't leave either. This is Entangled in Chaos. Understand the chaos, break the pattern. Let me back up, because the explosion didn't start with the card. It started long before, with a sentence I'd heard so many times it had stopped sounding like a threat and started sounding like weather. Every so often, out of nowhere, she would say some version of this. One day you're going to do something that makes me so angry I'll leave you. Not during a fight, not about anything specific. Just dropped into an ordinary afternoon, like a stake driven into the ground. For years I thought she was warning me. It took me a long time to understand she was reserving something. She was preloading the day it would end, so that whenever it came, the blueprint was already drawn and the fault was already mine. That's the first piece, and I'll come back to it. Hold on to it. Now the card, I want to be honest about my part, because this story isn't a courtroom and I'm not only the witness. I gave her access to that card, I trusted her with it, and when the spending kept climbing, I didn't sit down and have a calm, direct conversation about money. I sent a text. I announced a consequence. I locked the card and told her to figure out what she owed. Was the boundary reasonable? Yes. Was the way I delivered it, by decree over text after months of silent resentment, the move of a man who'd run out of better tools? Also, yes. I'd stopped talking to my partner a long time before that. I'd started managing her. So the card declined, she called, I reminded her, and the house did what the house always did. Within a minute, a locked card had become a betrayal. Within 5, the betrayal had become the end of everything. The move, the daughter, the money demanded now in capital letters. A reaction so far out of proportion to the trigger that if I'd shown it to a stranger with no context, they'd have assumed I'd done something unforgivable. I hadn't, I'd enforced a limit, that was all. And then, as always, the storm blew toward the door. She was leaving, we were done. I sat there and felt the strangest thing a person can feel at the supposed end of a marriage. Nothing, a flat, gray nothing, because I already knew how this movie ended. She'd be furious for a while, a week, maybe 2. And then one day it would simply be gone, unmentioned, unresolved, as if it had happened to different people. The same way it had vanished the last dozen times. Which raises the question I spent years refusing to ask. If it never sticks, if the leaving is never real, then what is it actually for? Let me pause the story here, because underneath all of this there's a pattern, and it has parts. The first part is what happens when you put a boundary in front of someone whose sense of safety is built on control. For most people, a locked card is an inconvenience. You're annoyed, you sort it out, you move on. But for a person who needs to be in control of everything, the money, the schedule, the emotional temperature of the house, a boundary isn't an inconvenience. It's a threat to the entire structure they stand on, and they don't experience the size of the actual thing. They experience the size of the loss of control. So the reaction isn't calibrated to the card, it's calibrated to the panic. And the explosion has a job: to make the boundary so expensive, so exhausting, so catastrophic to hold that you'll never dare set another one. It works by teaching you that every limit you draw will cost you a war. Draw enough of those and get shelled every time, and eventually you stop drawing them. You just hand over the card. The second part is that preemptive sentence. One day you'll make me leave. Psychologists would call it a lot of things, but you don't need the vocabulary to feel the mechanism. It's a landmine buried in advance. It keeps you walking carefully across your own life, scanning every step because you've been told the ground is rigged and the trigger is you. And when the explosion finally comes, the narrative is already written. She warned you, you did it, whatever it was. The third part is the one that confused me the longest. Why the leaving never actually happens. Here's what I finally understood. Following through, actually moving out, actually building a separate life, actually letting me go do my own thing without her would mean giving up control. And there is no version of this pattern where control gets surrendered. The threat to leave isn't a plan, it's a lever. Leaving for real would end the leverage. So the storm always circles back, not because of love and not because of forgiveness, but because the door was never really the point. The threat of the door was. I want to be careful here, the way this channel is always careful. I'm not diagnosing anyone. I don't know everything that built her, though I know enough to know that nobody detonates like that from a calm and steady place. She was caught in this pattern as surely as I was. The pattern doesn't need a villain. It only needs one person who reaches for control when they're afraid, and another person willing to keep paying whatever it costs to avoid the blast. For 20-some years, that other person was me. And that brings me to the part of this I hid from longest, because it's the part that was actually mine. Here's a detail I left out. We weren't even married anymore. We'd legally divorced years earlier. On paper, I was free. No contract, no obligation, nothing binding me to that house at all. And I stayed anyway. So I have to be honest about what was really holding the door shut, and it wasn't her. It was our daughter. An adult now, well into her 20s, still living with us, still unable or unallowed to support herself. My fear that if I left, she'd have no floor under her, that fear was the anchor. Everything else was just the chain it sat on. This is where family systems thinking cuts closest to the bone. In a house organized around chaos, everyone develops a role, and the roles hold each other in place. My partner's role was the storm. My role was the one who kept the structure standing no matter what, the overfunctioner, the last responsible adult, the human foundation. And our daughter's role was the one that kept me there, the person who could never be allowed to fall, which meant I could never be allowed to leave. But look closely at what that protection actually did. By standing in front of the storm for her, year after year, I wasn't teaching her how to weather it. I was teaching her that someone else always would. I thought I was holding an umbrella over my child. I was really just standing in the lightning longer and calling it love. A person doesn't learn to hold their own weight while someone keeps volunteering to hold it for them. I told myself I was staying for her, but some of it, I have to say this plainly, was that staying was easier than the conversation. The daughter was the reason I gave. The fear of my own decision was the reason underneath. Now go back to that 90-second phone call and watch how the meaning changes. The explosion over the card was never about money. It was a nervous system experiencing a boundary as a threat and reaching for the only tool it trusted to erase the boundary, overwhelming force. The threat to move out with our daughter wasn't a plan. It was the lever, the most powerful one in the house, because it aimed straight at the one fear that kept me anchored. And my flat gray nothing on the couch, that wasn't peace. That was a man so far past his own exhaustion that the end of his marriage registered as a day off. That's not detachment. That's numbness, the armor you grow after years in a cycle, the armor that stops being protection and starts being a cage. None of this got better because I finally understood it. Insight isn't a tool, so let me give you the tools, the ones I wish someone had handed me 20 years earlier. First, hold the boundary through the explosion. When a limit triggers a detonation, the detonation is not evidence that you were wrong. It's evidence that the limit landed on something load-bearing. And a behavior that has always worked gets louder right before it stops working. Psychologists call that an extinction burst. Expect it. The first locked card will bring the biggest storm. Lock it anyway and stay standing while it blows. Second, stop chasing the exit. When someone has threatened to leave a dozen times and never gone, the threat is not a crisis to be managed, it's a move in a game. Managing it is how you keep playing. The steady response to "we're done again" is not to argue, not to chase, not to beg. It's to let the silence sit there and be answered by nothing. Control loses its power the moment it stops getting a reaction. Third, separate what's actually yours. You are not responsible for regulating another adult's emotions. You cannot de-escalate a person who is getting something out of the escalation. You'll only exhaust yourself trying. Refusing to jump into that fire isn't cold. It's the sanest thing you can do in a burning room. Your job is your own peace. That's the whole list. Fourth, and this is the hard one, return responsibility to the people it belongs to, including the ones you love most. If there's an adult in your house you've been shielding from their own life, the shield is part of the cage, theirs and yours. That doesn't mean cruelty. It means a real conversation, a real timeline, a real handing back of the weight. They may panic, they may rage, let them. Nobody grows while the net is still under them. Taking the net away is not abandonment. It's the belief, finally expressed, that they can stand. And fifth, name the real reason you're staying out loud to yourself. For years I said I was staying for my daughter. The truth was that I was staying because leaving required a decision, and the decision terrified me. Fear is a lot easier to carry when it's wearing the costume of duty. Take the costume off, look at what's really underneath. You cannot walk out of a trap you keep describing as a sacrifice. I told you the leaving never sticks. Let me end there. For years I waited for her to be the one who finally followed through, who moved, who ended it, who made the decision so I wouldn't have to. I treated my freedom like something she was holding and might one day hand back. She was never going to, not because she's a monster, but because the whole architecture depended on the door staying shut. The person who built the pattern is never going to be the one who dismantles it. That was always going to be me. The marriage ended on paper years ago. What kept me in that house wasn't a marriage, and it wasn't even her. It was a role I'd agreed to play, one quiet capitulation at a time, until I'd mistaken the weight I was carrying for the shape of my own life. You can put that weight down, not with a scream, not with a final devastating argument that makes them finally see you. Just with one honest decision made on an ordinary afternoon about the one person in this whole story you were ever actually able to move. If any of this sounded like a house you're living in, technically free, and somehow still trapped, subscribe and stay with us. We're going to keep taking the chaos apart, one pattern at a time. Understand the chaos, break the pattern.